At 1 minute past midnight on a Saturday in August 2026, a 50% tariff quietly kicked in on nearly $20 billion worth of Canadian goods crossing into the United States. No ceremony, no signing, just a deadline that expired, and a trade relationship between two of the closest allies on Earth that has now been pushed further than almost anyone predicted a year ago. Whiskey bound for American liquor stores, hockey sticks headed for arenas across the Midwest, goose down jackets, cement, all of it, overnight, became significantly more expensive to sell south of the border. And in Ottawa, the reaction wasn't panic. It was something closer to defiance. This is the story of how a negotiation that both sides insisted was almost finished fell apart in a matter of hours. Why a Canadian government under intense pressure decided to hold a line instead of folding, and whether Donald Trump's long campaign of tariff threats against his northern neighbor has actually achieved what he wanted, or whether it has quietly backfired. To understand what happened this past week, you have to go back further than most headlines will take you, because this fight didn't start in August 2026. It started a year and a half earlier, and it has been building in fits and starts ever since. And if you want to actually follow this story past the headline of the day, because the next 2 weeks leading into September 8 are likely to move fast, staying subscribed means you'll catch every twist as it happens, rather than piecing it together after the fact. Axios, describing the scale of what just broke down, called it an unprecedented breakdown in relations with what is, in plain economic terms, the second largest trading partner the United States has anywhere in the world. That framing matters. This isn't a minor trade dispute with a small economy on the periphery of American commerce. Canada and the United States share the longest undefended border on the planet, and for decades, goods, parts, and raw materials have crossed that line so routinely that entire industries were built, assuming the border barely existed as an economic obstacle at all. What's happening now is a direct challenge to that assumption, and it's happening in real time. Rewind to February 1st, 2025. That's the date President Donald Trump signed an order imposing sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods, according to a timeline compiled from Wire reporting and confirmed by multiple outlets covering the trade war as it unfolded. The initial package included a 25% tariff on most Canadian imports and a 10% tariff specifically targeting Canadian energy products. The stated justification at the time was framed around fentanyl trafficking and illegal immigration across the northern border, a claim that multiple Canadian officials publicly disputed, given how small the volume of fentanyl seizures at that particular crossing actually was compared to the southern border. Whatever the justification, the impact was immediate. Canada's government at the time, still led by outgoing Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, responded within days. Trudeau, in a somber televised address from Ottawa, laid out more than $100 billion in retaliatory tariffs against the United States, according to reporting carried by the International New York Times and other wire services covering that address. He was blunt about the reluctance behind the move. "We don't want to be here," he told Canadians that night, describing a package that started with $30 billion in immediate retaliation and was set to expand to $125 billion worth of American goods within 3 weeks, giving Canadian businesses time to adjust. It was, by any measure, one of the sharpest breaks in the modern history of U.S.-Canada trade relations, a relationship that had functioned largely on autopilot since the original free trade agreement decades earlier. What followed over the next year was not a single dramatic showdown, but a long, grinding sequence of escalations, pauses, and partial retreats. Steel and aluminum tariffs were added to the mix. Automobiles became a flashpoint. A wide basket of consumer goods was pulled into the fight. Both the federal government in Ottawa and individual provincial governments scrambled to put together support programs for the industries getting hit hardest. Markets on both sides of the border wobbled through bouts of volatility whenever a new deadline approached. And underneath all of it, a grassroots boycott movement took shape inside Canada. According to tracking of the boycott's development, it began around February 2025 in direct response to both the tariffs and to Trump's repeated provocative suggestion that Canada should simply become the 51st American state. Canadians canceled trips across the border. Grocery store shelves in cities from Vancouver to Halifax started featuring little maple leaf stickers marking domestically made products. Anti-American sentiment, generally rare in a country that prides itself on its close relationship with its southern neighbor, became a measurable political force, showing up in polling and in consumer spending data alike. By February 2026, the legal foundation underneath a chunk of Trump's tariff strategy started to crack. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the president could not rely on emergency powers, specifically the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, to justify certain tariffs, according to reporting from financial outlet NerdWallet, summarizing the ruling and its implications for Canadian trade. That decision, handed down February 20th, 2026, cleared the way for some of the tariffs put in place back in 2025 to be reversed. It was a real legal setback for the administration's approach, even if it didn't end the broader trade conflict. Trump had leaned on the claim of a dual emergency, the fentanyl argument on one side and a broader trade imbalance argument on the other, to justify sweeping tariff powers under IEPA. The court's ruling didn't buy all of it, but rulings on paper don't automatically translate into rulings on the ground, and through the spring and early summer of 2026, the fight kept evolving. In June, Trump and new Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney sat down together at the G7 summit in Kananaskis, Alberta, an event photographed extensively by wire services showing the two leaders in what looked, at least on camera, like a cordial working lunch. Carney, a former central banker who took over leadership of Canada's government earlier in 2026, set an ambitious target. He said the two countries were aiming to land a new economic agreement by July 21st. That deadline came and went without a deal. The two sides kept talking, which in itself was viewed by some analysts as a modest sign of progress compared to the outright hostility of the year before. It's worth understanding why dairy, in particular, has always been such combustible territory in these negotiations, because this isn't the first time it's nearly derailed a deal. Back in 2018, during the original renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement that eventually became CUSMA, Trump raised the exact same complaint about Canada's supply management system. At that point, though, with a broader continental trade agreement hanging in the balance and business groups on all sides pushing hard for certainty, Trump ultimately let the issue go and allowed the new agreement to pass without forcing changes to Canadian dairy protections. That history matters now because it shows this specific fight has a track record of nearly blowing up talks before, only for practical economic pressure from industry to win out over ideological insistence. Whether that same pattern holds in 2026, with tensions already running far higher than they were 8 years ago, is one of the genuinely open questions hanging over these negotiations. One of the moves that kept negotiations alive was a concession from Ottawa. Canada canceled its digital services tax on American technology companies, a tax that would have hit firms like Meta and Amazon in order to preserve the broader trade talks, according to Reuters reporting from that period. Trump had threatened, in a post on his social media platform, to blow up the negotiations entirely and impose new tariffs specifically because of that digital tax, which had been scheduled to take effect that Monday. Sylvain Charlebois, a food industry analyst and professor at Dalhousie University, offered a memorable description of the dynamic at the time, telling reporters that Trump is basically one Truth Social post away from creating political chaos in Canada. Canceling the tax was, according to analysts quoted by Reuters, the easier concession for Carney to make politically. What came next would prove to be a far harder one to navigate. Because in that same social media post, Trump didn't just attack the digital tax. He turned his attention to something Canada has defended fiercely for decades, its dairy supply management system. This is where the red line in this story actually starts to take shape, and it's worth explaining clearly because it's been misrepresented more than once in the public back and forth. Canada's supply management system for dairy, eggs, and poultry dates back to the 1970s. It works by tightly controlling domestic production and limiting imports through steep tariffs that only kick in once a country exceeds a specific duty-free quota. Under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, negotiated during Trump's first term and often referred to by its Canadian name, CUSMA, the U.S. was granted a set amount of duty-free access for dairy exports into Canada. Anything above that quota faces tariffs that can, according to CBC's detailed explainer on the system, exceed 200% on specific products. Trump has repeatedly inflated that figure in public statements, claiming on Truth Social that Canada charges tariffs up to 400% on dairy products and has done so for years. CBC's reporting on the mechanics of the system pushes back directly on the framing, noting that those steep tariffs only apply above the negotiated quota level, not as a blanket charge on all U.S. dairy entering Canada. It's a genuinely contested point in the public conversation around this trade fight, and it's one worth flagging honestly rather than repeating either side's talking points as settled fact. What is not contested is how politically explosive this issue is inside Canada. Fen Hampson, a professor of international affairs and co-chair of the expert group on Canada-U.S. relations at Carleton University in Ottawa, told CBC that once the digital services tax was off the table, dairy became the next obvious target. I think we can expect that they will be coming after us on supply management as well, because it has been a long-standing irritant, Hampson said. He's right that it's long-standing. Trump raised the exact same complaint during the original 2018 negotiation of the free trade deal, and back then, he ultimately let the agreement pass without forcing the issue. This time, with tensions already running high over a full year of tariff escalation, the dairy question landed differently. It's also worth understanding just how organized the resistance to touching supply management has become inside Canadian politics, because this isn't simply a matter of one government's preference. Supply management effectively guarantees stable, predictable incomes for tens of thousands of dairy, egg, and poultry farmers concentrated heavily in Quebec and Ontario, provinces that carry enormous weight in Canadian federal elections. Any political party seen as willing to sacrifice that system for the sake of a trade deal risks a serious electoral backlash in exactly the regions it can least afford to lose. That's part of why, when the digital services tax fell relatively quickly, dairy did not. Canada's federal government has a legal cover here that didn't exist during the first term negotiation. A piece of legislation known as Bill C-202 now explicitly forbids Canadian negotiators from using supply management as a bargaining chip in trade talks, according to CBC's reporting on the legal landscape. That means even if a Canadian Prime Minister wanted to trade away dairy protections to get a broader deal done, the law currently stands in the way. Gabriel Brunet, a spokesperson for Canada U. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc put it plainly in a statement to Reuters, saying the federal government will always stand up for supply management. It's against this backdrop that the phrase red line started showing up explicitly in public statements from Canadian officials, not as a media label, but as language coming directly from government spokespeople. On August 19, 2026, in Quebec City, Quebec's Economy Minister Christine Frechette addressed reporters directly on this point, according to reporting carried by CP24 and CTV News. She reiterated what she called Canada's red line, not to be crossed, supply management on dairy, and what she described as the protection of culture and language. She added a line that captured the broader anxiety running through Canadian business circles at that moment, saying that what businesses need is confidence and stability and predictability. That statement came on the very day that Trump announced tariffs would be paused for 3 days after negotiators claimed they had struck what he called a very good deal for both parties. It felt for about 72 hours like the crisis might actually be resolved. It wasn't. And this is where the story turns sharply, because what happened over the following 3 days is central to understanding why this entire episode is being read by some analysts as a moment where Trump's pressure tactics ran into a wall rather than a win. The 3-day pause was set to expire at midnight heading into Wednesday, August 19th into 20, but Trump extended it again just hours before it was due to hit, according to CNBC's reporting, saying there was a soon-to-be agreement in the works. Negotiators from both countries then spent 3 intense days in Washington, D.C., working toward a final deal, according to Al Jazeera's coverage of the collapse. At various points during that week, officials on both sides signaled they were close. And then, late on Friday night, August 21st, it all fell apart. United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer said the breakdown came after Canada made what he described as last-minute demands that upset the agreement they thought they had reached, a characterization reported by Axios. Greer went further, framing the 50% tariffs that followed as, in his words, essentially payback, tied specifically to retaliatory measures Canada had already taken against earlier rounds of U.S. tariffs. The policy basis for those duties are related to measures that Canada took against the United States, Greer said, according to Axios' reporting, adding a pointed comment that there are now 2 countries in the world he considers to have retaliated against the U.S. in ways he views as improper. Prime Minister Mark Carney told a very different story. Speaking to reporters in Ottawa on Saturday morning, Carney called the collapse a miscalculation and laid the blame squarely on demands from the Trump administration that he described as uneconomic and unfair, according to NBC News' reporting on that press conference. In recent days, the United States proposed new terms that were uneconomic, unfair, and undermined the net benefits for Canada, and called into question the reliability of any deal, Carney told reporters. In short, they asked too much, and they offered too little. It's a rare moment of a sitting Canadian Prime Minister using language that direct about an American administration, and it signals just how far the relationship has drifted from the cordial G7 photo op just 2 months earlier. At the stroke of midnight, the 50% tariffs went into effect, hitting a wide swath of Canadian exports. The Washington Post's coverage laid out some of the specific products caught in the net: Crown Royal whiskey, goose down jackets, ice hockey equipment, and cement, among a long list of others. Certain categories were carved out of the new measures, notably energy, potash, and critical minerals, reflecting how deeply integrated those sectors remain across the border, regardless of the political temperature. According to Axios, this was part of a broader threat Trump had made the previous month to invoke a specific, rarely used legal tool, Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, to justify these additional 50% duties on goods, including alcohol, hockey equipment, cement, and dairy products. No U.S. president has ever actually used Section 338 to impose tariffs since it became law nearly a century ago, which makes this a genuinely unusual moment in American trade policy history, regardless of how the broader dispute resolves. Carney did not respond with restraint. Standing in Ottawa, he announced that Canada would match the new American tariffs dollar for dollar, a phrase he used in a formal statement reported by Al Jazeera. The retaliatory measures, he said, would specifically target American steel, dairy, and electronics industries, among others, and are scheduled to take effect on September 8th, giving both governments and affected businesses roughly 2 weeks to prepare. CNBC's reporting added further detail on the scope, noting the retaliatory list also includes agricultural equipment and pulp and paper products, sectors chosen deliberately to apply pressure on American industries, and not coincidentally, on states and congressional districts where those industries carry political weight. Canada will match Washington's new tariffs dollar for dollar in order to protect Canadian workers, farmers, families, and businesses, Carney told reporters in Ottawa, according to Al Jazeera's coverage of that Saturday announcement. It's worth pausing on the specific sectors Canada chose to hit back on. Steel and dairy are politically loaded categories in American manufacturing and farm states, respectively, the kind of industries whose workers show up prominently in national elections. Whether that targeting is coincidental or strategic is something analysts will be debating for weeks, but it's hard to look at the list and not see at least some element of political calculation behind it. If you're finding this level of detail useful, this is exactly the kind of story where subscribing actually pays off, because trade negotiations like this rarely resolve in one clean announcement. They tend to lurch forward through exactly the kind of late Friday night collapses and early Saturday morning press conferences we just walked through, and each one changes the picture a little. Beyond the direct tariff numbers, it's worth remembering that this dispute isn't happening in a vacuum on the Canadian side either. The consumer boycott movement that began back in February 2025, largely in response both to the tariffs themselves and to Trump's repeated public musings about Canada becoming the 51st American state, has had measurable staying power. Tracking of that movement describes decreased trading relations between the two countries, canceled travel plans by ordinary Canadians who once crossed the border routinely for shopping trips or vacations, and a broader current of anti-Americanism that would have been almost unthinkable in Canadian public life just a few years earlier. Grocery chains across the country leaned into the moment, promoting Canadian-made alternatives on their shelves. Ipsos polling, cited in Canadian business coverage, found that even as headline tensions eased at various points, Canadians continued shifting their spending habits away from American products and services, a trend that outlasted several individual news cycles about tariff pauses and temporary deals. Now, here's where the human cost of all this starts to come into sharper focus, because tariff percentages on a press release are one thing, and their effect on actual factory floors is another. Flavio Volpe, president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association and a member of the federal government's group of insider trade advisors, laid out the stakes for Canada's auto sector in blunt terms to CTV News. He said any negotiated tariff rate on Canadian auto parts has to land below the industry's profit margin, or the math simply stops working. It's got to be below 6%, and for 60 years, we've been working at 0%, Volpe told CTV. That's a striking data point on its own. An industry that has operated for 6 decades under essentially tariff-free conditions across the Canada-US border, now facing a completely different reality. Volpe's warning wasn't abstract either. He said that if automakers are forced to either absorb or pass along hundreds of millions of dollars in extra costs to consumers each year, manufacturing plants in Canadian towns like Brampton and Woodstock, Ontario, could simply relocate operations to the United States. That's not a hypothetical dressed up for dramatic effect. It's the kind of decision that auto executives on both sides of the border are actively modeling right now, weighing labor costs, tariff exposure, and supply chain logistics against each other in real time. It's a useful reminder that this entire dispute, however abstract it can sound in terms of percentages and billions of dollars, ultimately comes down to decisions being made inside boardrooms about where to build things and employ people. A 50% tariff doesn't just show up as a slightly higher price tag on a bottle of Canadian whiskey in an American liquor store. It ripples through supply chains, hiring plans, and long-term investment decisions on both sides of a border that, until relatively recently, functioned almost like an internal state line for a huge swath of North American manufacturing. So where does that leave the bigger question? This story is really asking, has Trump's pressure campaign against Canada actually worked, or has it backfired? The honest answer, based on what's verifiable right now, is that it's producing a mixed and genuinely uncertain outcome, not a clean win for either side. On one hand, Trump has repeatedly demonstrated he's willing to use extraordinary tools, tariff powers barely used in the history of American trade law, to extract concessions. And he did get one real concession out of Ottawa already, the cancellation of the digital services tax. That's a tangible win for his approach. On the other hand, the core issue he seems most fixated on, dairy supply management, has run directly into both a hardened political position from Quebec and other provinces and an actual piece of federal legislation that legally restricts Canadian negotiators from trading it away. That's not spin. That's a structural obstacle, and it means Trump's tariff pressure, however painful economically, may be running up against a wall that simple economic leverage alone can't knock down. At the same time, the backlash inside Canada has hardened rather than softened over the 18 months this fight has run. The boycott movement that began in early 2025 hasn't disappeared. If anything, sustained political tension has kept it alive longer than similar consumer movements typically last. And Carney, despite being a technocratic former central banker who came into office without the kind of populist political brand that often thrives on this kind of confrontation, has now publicly used the word miscalculation to describe the American administration's approach and match the new tariffs dollar for dollar rather than seeking another extension. That's a notably firmer posture than what many expected from his government just a few months ago, and it suggests that continued pressure from Washington may be pushing Ottawa toward more resistance, not less. There's also a broader signal worth noting here, one that extends beyond Canada specifically. USTR Jameson Greer's comment about there now being 2 countries in the world he considers to have retaliated improperly against U.S. tariffs is a small but telling detail. It suggests the administration sees this Canada dispute as connected to a wider pattern of trade confrontations happening simultaneously on multiple fronts, which raises a genuinely open question about how much bandwidth and political capital Washington has to fight sustained trade battles with multiple partners at once, especially heading into a period where inflation and consumer prices remain politically sensitive domestic issues inside the United States itself. It's also worth being honest about what remains genuinely uncertain heading into September 8th, the date Canada's retaliatory tariffs are set to take effect. Negotiations between the 2 countries have, at multiple points over the past 18 months, appeared to collapse only to be revived days or weeks later. There's nothing in the public record suggesting this pattern is guaranteed to continue, but there's also nothing suggesting the door is permanently closed. Officials from both governments have used language throughout this saga, phrases like hypothetical on a hypothetical from Carney, back when he was fielding questions about the possibility of a deal not being reached, that leaves plenty of room for further last-minute maneuvering before September 8th actually arrives. Whether that maneuvering produces another pause, a genuine deal, or full-blown trade war between 2 of the most economically intertwined countries on the planet remains something nobody can honestly predict with confidence right now. Before we get to the sources behind everything you just heard, it's worth sitting with the scale of what's actually being risked here. Canada and the United States share the longest international border in the world, and historically, one of the most deeply integrated manufacturing and agricultural relationships anywhere on the planet. Parts for a single vehicle can cross that border multiple times during assembly before a finished car ever reaches a dealership. Dairy farmers in Wisconsin and dairy farmers in Quebec have spent decades operating under a shared, if occasionally contentious, regulatory framework. None of that disappears overnight because of a 50% tariff, but every additional month, this dispute drags on adds friction, cost, and uncertainty to a system that was built over generations on the assumption that friction and cost would stay low. That's really what's at stake underneath all the political rhetoric coming out of both Ottawa and Washington this week. There's another layer to this worth walking through because the Supreme Court ruling from February 2026 didn't actually end the tariff fight the way some early headlines implied. The court's decision addressed tariffs specifically justified under the president's emergency powers claim, the IEEPA-based measures tied to the administration's framing of fentanyl trafficking and border security as national emergencies. It did not strike down every tariff mechanism available to the executive branch, and it clearly didn't prevent the administration from reaching for an entirely different legal tool months later, the rarely used Section 338 provision from the Tariff Act of 1930 to justify the 50% duties that took effect this past weekend. That's an important distinction because it shows the legal fight over presidential tariff authority is really a series of separate battles over different statutory tools, not one single question that gets resolved once and stays resolved. Legal scholars tracking executive trade authority have noted that Section 338 in particular is largely untested in modern courts precisely because it has sat unused for nearly a century, which means any legal challenge to its use here would likely be venturing into genuinely uncharted territory for American trade law. That legal uncertainty cuts both ways politically. For the Trump administration, having an alternative legal pathway after the Supreme Court narrowed the IEEPA approach demonstrates a degree of persistence and legal creativity in pursuing its tariff agenda. For critics of that approach, the fact that a nearly 100-year-old, never-before-used provision was needed to keep the pressure campaign alive after courts pushed back on the first method suggests the legal foundation for this entire strategy may be less solid than it appears from the outside. Either way, if this dispute continues past September 8th without a resolution, it's plausible that Section 338 itself becomes the subject of legal challenges from Canadian exporters or American import businesses affected by the new duties, which would add an entirely new front to a conflict that is already being fought simultaneously in trade negotiations, public statements, and now, potentially, in court. Now, a quick word on where all of this information came from, because transparency matters, especially on a story with this many moving parts and this much political noise surrounding it. The core timeline of the trade war, from its February 2025 origins through the Supreme Court ruling in February 2026, comes from Wikipedia's sourced timeline compilation and NerdWallet's dedicated coverage of Canadian tariff developments, cross-checked against wire reporting. The most recent collapse of talks and the imposition of the 50% tariffs comes directly from Al Jazeera, NBC News, Axios, and CNBC, all of whom covered Carney's Saturday press conference, and Greer's public statements in real time. The Washington Post provided the specific breakdown of which Canadian products are affected by the new tariffs. Reuters and CBC provided the detailed reporting on the dairy supply management dispute, including direct quotes from analyst Fen Hampson, food industry professor Sylvain Charlebois, and Trade Ministry spokesperson Gabriel Brunet. CP24 and CTV News are the source for Quebec Economy Minister Christine Frichette's explicit red-line comments, as well as Flavio Volpe's remarks on the auto industry's tariff threshold. One point genuinely remains contested and deserves to be flagged as such rather than smoothed over. Trump's repeated public claim that Canada charges a flat 400% tariff on American dairy products is disputed by CBC's own explainer on how the supply management quota system actually functions, which notes that steep tariffs only apply to volumes exceeding a specific negotiated quota, not as a blanket rate on all dairy imports. Both framings have been stated publicly by officials on their respective sides, and neither this script nor any single source can definitively settle which characterization is more accurate, without a deeper technical audit of actual trade volumes and tariff schedules, which falls outside the scope of what's been independently verified here. It's presented to you, honestly, as an open dispute between two governments rather than as a settled fact in either direction. So here's where this leaves things, and here's the question really worth sitting with. Trump has spent a year and a half applying escalating economic pressure on one of America's oldest and closest allies, using tools that, in some cases, no American president has ever actually used before in this way. And what he's gotten back is a government in Ottawa that gave up one specific concession, the digital services tax, but has now hardened its position on almost everything else, backed by both provincial political pressure and actual federal law. Is that a pressure campaign succeeding through incremental wins, or is it a pressure campaign that's teaching a close trading partner to simply build resilience against future American demands, regardless of who occupies the White House next? Do you think Ottawa's decision to match these tariffs dollar for dollar rather than seeking another delay was the right call, or was it about escalation that will end up hurting Canadian workers and consumers just as much as American ones? Let us know what you think happens between now and September 8th. That's where we'll leave this one for now. Things are moving fast, and both governments have shown repeatedly that positions can shift within days rather than weeks. So this is a story worth watching closely as it develops. If this breakdown, and everything leading up to it, is the kind of geopolitical and trade story you want broken down clearly and honestly, rather than reduced to a headline, subscribing means the next update on this negotiation, whatever direction it takes, lands directly with you instead of getting buried in the noise. September 8th is a real deadline, not a symbolic one, and there's a genuine chance the next twist in this story happens before most news outlets even have time to react. Subscribing now is the simplest way to make sure you're not finding out 3 days late. And if you've made it this far, you clearly care about how this actually plays out for workers, farmers, and consumers on both sides of this border, not just the political theater around it. Subscribe, stay with the channel, and let's keep tracking this one together as it unfolds.